So most of us in the US and worldwide have been noticing this unnatural fog. It seems to be everywhere, from the mountains to the rivers and across every continent. A thick, chemical-smelling fog. A fog that has reportedly caused many people to become ill, as well as leave large size, almost like plastic looking ice in its wake. So what is this fog? Where is it coming from? Is it from the drones? Or is it from something like Operation Sea Spray that we know that the federal government of the United States has done to its citizens on numerous times? And this video is forgotten history. I advise you sit down with a cup of coffee, put your feet up, and listen for the next 7 minutes as I walk you through from the 1940s to the 1970s with Operation Sea Spray and several of the programs that allowed the U.S. government to cover and blanket us in multiple types of bacteria. Bacteria that has reportedly been found in the fog called FOGVID 2024. Like, comment, and subscribe. Due to a possible Soviet attack, the U.S. staged more than 200 domestic tests aimed at assessing national vulnerabilities to biological warfare. Ira Baldwin, Camp Detrick scientific director during World War II, left his position after the Allied victory in 1945 and returned to teaching at the University of Wisconsin. It's important to stop here and discuss who Ira Baldwin actually was. He was an Indiana farm boy, World War I veteran, and a part-time preacher. Ira Baldwin became a noted agricultural bacteriologist at the University of Wisconsin and the civilian science director of the United States Biological Weapons Research Program at Camp Detrick. Baldwin was born on a 40-acre farm in 1895 and spent the summers of his youth husking corn and selling ducks to earn money for college. Baldwin came from a deeply religious family with Quaker grandparents. Baldwin also preached in local churches that lacked regular ministers. In World War I, he served stateside as a second lieutenant in an artillery unit commanding a burial detail during the 1918 influenza epidemic. Baldwin began his graduate work at University of Wisconsin in the mid-1920s, and by the time the U.S. entered World War II, he had become chair of the bacteriology department. Then in November 1942, Baldwin got a call from Colonel William Cabreach of the Army's Chemical Warfare Service requesting his presence at a top secret meeting in Washington. At first, it was just speculative talk, but after announcing that Germany and Japan were supporting biological warfare programs, Baldwin was asked and assembled other scientists whether they thought the U.S. could produce tons of its own bacterial agents. Absolutely, Baldwin replied. If you could do it in a test tube, you could do it in a 10,000-gallon tank. And if you get enough tanks, I'm sure you will get tons. A month later, the general was on the phone again asking Baldwin to lead the effort to do just that. Baldwin considered the moral implications of this and then finally said, "You start out with the idea in war of killing people," he would later say, "and that to me is the immoral part of it. It doesn't make much difference how you kill them." Armed with this rationalization, Baldwin again headed east, this time in charge of the science and administration of America's biological weapons research program. Baldwin recruited scientists for his facility, later observing that unless a person was also needed by the Manhattan Project, he usually got the men he requested. Baldwin's team began work on the production of botulinum toxin and anthrax bacterial spores in 1943. He scouted locations for outdoor biological weapons testing, eventually settling on Horn Island off the Mississippi coast. As the war dragged on, Camp Detrick expanded, employing more than 2,000 people at its height and conducting tests responsible for the death of 658,000 animals. Faced with requests for 1 million anthrax bombs from the U.S. and British governments, Baldwin helped out by setting up a large-scale manufacturing facility in Indiana. After World War II ended, Baldwin returned to the University of Wisconsin, becoming Vice President of Academic Affairs in 1948 and Special Assistant to the university's president a decade later. He continued to advise the United States on biological weapons, evaluating the threat posed by Cold War adversaries, and suggesting a series of tests on U.S. cities with supposedly harmless bacteria in order to evaluate how pathogens might spread if released by enemy agents. He officially retired from the University of Wisconsin in 1966, but continued working in the field of international agriculture for a number of years. He died in 1999 at the age of 104. Baldwin was responsible for the secret test that eventually covered dozens of American cities. In an October 1948 report, Baldwin said that the U.S. was particularly vulnerable to these types of attacks. But in order to determine the precise nature of these vulnerabilities, secret field tests would have to be done to ascertain the vulnerability of targets of potential interest to the enemy. The Army's Chemical Corps, which ran Camp Detrick, agreed with Baldwin's assessment and set up a special operations division at Camp Detrick to carry out the test. Its first target was the Pentagon. In August of 1949, the Special Operations Division operatives infiltrated the world's largest office building and sprayed bacteria into the Pentagon's air handling system, which then spread throughout the structure. The operatives moved to larger scale testing, releasing clouds containing supposedly harmless bacteria from Navy ships off Norfolk, Virginia in April 1950 and San Francisco coast in September 1950. The success of the first field test only increased demand for more experiments. In response to an Air Force request in 1953, the Chemical Corps created the St. Joe program, and operatives staged mock anthrax attacks on St. Louis, Minneapolis, and Winnipeg. Bacteria were released from generators placed on top of cars, and local governments were told that invisible smoke screens were being deployed to mask the city on enemy radar. The next stage was to increase dispersal patterns, dispensing particles from airplanes to find out how wide of an area they could affect. The first large area concept experiment in 1957 involved dispersing microorganisms over a swath from South Dakota to Minnesota. Monitoring revealed that some of the particles eventually traveled some 1,200 miles away. Morcessin bacteria was used in open air testing, which continued through the 1970s. This bacteria was used throughout Washington's National Airport a year later, and agents dropped light bulbs filled with organisms onto the tracks in New York's subway system. "I think it spreads pretty good," said a participant, because you had a natural aerosol developed every few minutes from every train that went past. President Nixon's 1969 termination of the United States Offensive Biological Weapons Program brought an end to the open-air testing, but the American public did not even realize this had happened until 1977. On Wednesday, August the 3rd, 1977, the U.S. Senate and Select Committee of Intelligence had a meeting about the Project MKUltra and the CIA's Program Research and Behavioral Modification. After reading several pages from the Select Committee of Intelligence and U.S. Senate research, what I have found is that they were also studying blood research and how organisms move through organic materials of animals, plants, and humans. It was called blood grouping.